Hello and welcome to this special event between Warwick Data Science Society and Warwick Economics Society. I'm Yasser, the Outreach and Talks Officer for Warwick Data Science Society, and today we're looking at game theory. We have three speakers this evening. Our first speaker is Vinay, a second-year economics student and the academic officer at Warwick Economics Society. Our second speaker is also an academics officer at Warwick Economics Society, and her name is Juliet. Together they'll cover the basics of game theory in our next section. Our last speaker is our very own Warwick Data Science Society President Tim. He'll go through how you can use Python programming to write your own strategies based on game theory to then battle against one another with prizes for the winners. So there's a lot to cover. Let me pass on to Vinay with our first section.
Thank you. So hello and welcome to this virtual talk centered around the exploration of game theory beyond the book. So as Yasser said, my name is Vinay and I'm a second year economics student. I'm also one of the academic officers at Warwick Economics Society alongside Juliet. And so my aim today is to introduce you to the intuition behind games and how we can study them to model outcomes of scenarios across a range of subjects and topics. So firstly, some of you may be familiar with the term game theory and may have come across it during your studies at uni or even sixth form. But for those of you a little less familiar, I would just like to start by introducing you to what it actually is and how we use it. So game theory is a mathematical toolkit used to analyze interdependent decision problems. So when we think about interdependence, it's essentially where one person's actions affect what the other should do. So we could view anything, any social interaction that we have in our daily lives as a game if we wanted to. For example, traffic jams, conflict, auctions, whatever you think of, you could probably pass it off as a game. So in order to actually use game theory, we have to define three different things. And the first one would be players. So this would include any kind of party within a game that has decisions to make. For example, I choose A, you choose B. That would kind of be, we would be players. And the second would be actions. So that would encompass all the different choices available to us players in this scenario. Finally, payoffs would include all outcomes for each combination of choices used. So let's take the traffic jam, for example. If you decided to stop and I decided to choose go, then the payoff for this scenario would include the outcome for this combination of choices that we've both chosen. So I would benefit, I'd be able to go, and you would have to stop and wait. So like all models, we have to make assumptions in order to fully take advantage of what game theory has to offer. So we assume that these payoffs must include everything that the players care about within this game. So this means that payoffs account for the long-run consequences of their actions, the players' appetite for risk, as well as the enjoyment they receive from essentially hurting other players within the game. And so for this reason, we have to model each player as acting to maximize their own payoff, which in the real world doesn't always hold true. Sometimes it does. So we just kind of have to play along with that. So this theory kind of illustrates three problems for players within a game. Firstly, understanding the game that they're playing itself. Sometimes that can be tricky. Secondly, forming expectations about what the other players will do, which is often the hardest part, and then finding the best response possible to the expected actions of the other players within the game. So now I'm going to put game theory into context for you guys so we can really delve deeper into how it works. And so to do this, I'm going to discuss a popular British daytime show called Golden Balls, which essentially uses a spit or steal game in its final round to pit the remaining two contestants against each other for a final cash prize. So each contestant is given a set of two balls from a bag, and one of them is marked split and the other is marked steal. Now they must choose one of the balls to confirm their decision about what to do with the cash prize they're presented with. But before making this decision, it's important to note that they're sat opposite each other on a table and they are allowed to speak to each other beforehand about their choices. So if they both choose split, then they both each receive half the jackpot. That's pretty self-explanatory. If they both choose steal, then none of them get the jackpot. But the interesting kind of play arises when one contestant chooses steal and the other one chooses split. So the contestant choosing steal will take the entire jackpot home, leaving the other with nothing as the loser. And this can be seen in the payoff matrix on the slide. But more formally, I'm going to move on to the game of chicken. This is also known as the hawk-dove game. It's a model of conflict that involves two players who are using a shared resource. Now, this shared resource could be anything. It could be a jackpot of money. It could also be food. But this, in its most simplest form, can be modeled by two people who are driving towards each other on a collision course, so a single carriage road, and it only fits one car. So two people are driving towards each other, and at least one of them must swerve or they will both die. But if only one driver swerves and the other one doesn't, then the one who swerved would essentially be perceived as a chicken, a loser, and the other would be able to pass through essentially scot-free and win the game. So during this game, both players are trying to decide on their best response, one which yields the highest payoff for themselves, given the opponent's action profile, and that's the range of actions that the opponent can undertake and the payoffs in each scenario. So in order to form a best response, players have to predict what the others in the game may do, and then decide on the best action moving forward. So in this game of chicken, the most obvious response by both players, at least to me, would be to kind of both swerve. In that way, they'd avoid crashing and therefore a lethal outcome. But, knowing this, a player may assume the other to be reasonable and swerve, and so can think to themselves, you know what, maybe I can just keep driving forward. If I'm assuming that the other one's going to swerve, which they should be doing, then I can essentially win the game, keep driving, and they will lose. So this in itself creates an unstable equilibrium whereby players will most likely end up in the bottom left and the top right corners of the payoff matrix, as you can see on the slide. So one will go straight, the other one will swerve, and vice versa. And this would create one winner and one loser in this situation. If it's played as a single stage game, then it's completely down to chance as to what the other player will do, as they will need to anticipate the use of bluffs and how risk averse the player is, as we mentioned before. But the interesting scenario arises if we were to take this game and repeat it either finitely or infinite number of times. We could then study the interaction between immediate gains and then long-term incentives. So in terms of repeating, it essentially involves taking the same stage game, so for example, this game of chicken, and playing it again and again, either for a number of periods of which the players are aware, or for an infinite number of rounds. And when repeating a game like chicken, each player is able to build up a reputation, and then they can allude to what they might do in the future. And this way, they're able to kind of use threats and punishments in order to coerce their opposition into doing what they want them to do. For example, if the other player ever chooses to drive straight, you could then threaten and say, do you know what, I'm also going to drive straight, and therefore we both lose, we both crash, and you will take a payoff of minus 1,000. But the extent to which threats and punishments work in repeated games really depends on the payoffs involved. Sometimes if the punishment's too severe for the threatening player, the one making the threat, then it may not seem that credible to the opposition. If we were both playing this game and I said, you know what, I don't care if you swerve, if you don't swerve, then I'm going to keep going and we're both going to crash. It doesn't seem so likely because both of us would die. So it really does depend on the payoffs involved. But moving on generally, the hawk-dove game has been heavily utilized in evolutionary game theory to model a contest between animals over a shared resource, as we mentioned before, food. So here, the hawk and dove refer to two subtypes of the same species with different strategies. So the hawk would be one that first displays a lot of aggression and essentially will fight until it either wins or loses the game, therefore the food. But the dove also first kind of displays a sense of aggression, but will retreat if it's faced with major escalation by the hawk. If the dove doesn't sense a sense of kind of major escalation, then it will attempt to share these resources. And from this, biologists have been able to explain why most animal contests in nature involve only really ritual fighting behaviors as opposed to full-on outright battles. But hopefully this has given you a digestible introduction into the technical background behind game theory. To use later on during this talk when you come up with your own strategies using Python with the Data Science Society. So now I'm just going to hand on to Juliet, who will continue our.
Yeah. Is that sharing with you? Right, so hi all, I'm Juliet, a second year ePace student and the other academic officer for Warwick Economic Society, and I'll be following on from what Vinay has introduced on the more technical side of game theory, and so I'll try and give you an understanding of game theory's applications, its rich history and uses in the real world outside of economics textbooks. So game theory is said to have been formally invented in 1944 by John van Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern with their publishing of their book Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. And since, game theory has become extremely important in modern analysis and decision-making, so much so that since the 1970s, 12 economists have been awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for their research in game theory. Game theory is really everywhere in real-world competitive situations, from missile defense, which was historically seen in the Cold War and I'll be talking about later, price wars in markets for consumer goods, bidding at auction, advertising, elections and voting, insurance, you name it, there is definitely a game theory application for it. So all these obviously involve strategy, whereby there are optimal strategies for players in games in the way that players know strategies that will enable them to achieve their desired outcomes. The simplest example of this, a game of noughts and crosses, illustrates how after learning how to play, you likely found a strategy of playing that enabled you at least to draw with your opponent, if not win. If your opponent made a mistake and you were lucky enough to notice it. So sticking to this strategy ensures that you won't lose, so it becomes your dominant strategy. So going back to Van Neumann and Morgenstern, which you can see in this picture, their book became a staple for mathematically inclined economists and attracted attention and later funding from the RAND Corporation. So what is the RAND Corporation? The RAND Corporation stands for Research and Development Corporation, and it was created by the US Air Force as a non-profit research organization after World War II to study US policy problems, so especially those involving defense. RAND's main focus was performing strategic studies on intercontinental nuclear war. Many early game theory researchers were backed by the US Department of Defense itself and the RAND Corporation, as they looked at possibly mutually assured destruction in the Cold War as complex games. But this also gave game theory a somewhat inhuman reputation, so far removed from the possibilities of nuclear warfare and the bloodshed that might come with it. Some at the time also saw game theory as an overvalued tool for being thought of as able to solve problems that it and the most powerful computers at the time could not solve. So in 1950, two RAND scholars, Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher, carried out an experiment which introduced the game we now know as the prisoner's dilemma, which, even having studied A-level economics or in your first year modules, will definitely come up. And it was actually formally named by a Princeton mathematician named Albert William Tucker. So the prisoner's dilemma, which basically provides a framework for understanding how to strike a balance between cooperation and competition, is a useful tool for strategic decision-making and hence has practical applications in fields ranging from economics, of course, to psychology, biology, and political science. A prominent example we can look at with very real-world implications is when a budget needs to be ratified in the US legislature. So due to escalating partisanship, Republicans and Democrats have become increasingly competitive rather than cooperative, leaving deadlocks such as the most recent and also longest ever US government shutdown, which ended after 35 days in January 2019. If any of you remember, that was over funding for Trump's wall. It is in the interest of both parties here not to cooperate and appear strong in the face of opposition, i.e. not to give in to the other party's demands, so as to keep the vote of their supporters or maybe attract new voters for kind of showing their power over their opposition. However, the social good is not maximised in deadlock, as we saw in the last shutdown, which cost the US government $3 billion in back pay for furloughed workers, and essentially shut down the US economy for 35 days. The prisoner's dilemma can also be applied to competitive situations between rival businesses. This is particularly prominent in a market where there are two main competitors, take Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and Apple and Samsung, for example. If we think about these rival products and the payoff matrix, it is in the interest of, for example, Pepsi to defect and lower its prices to increase its market share and profits. Though if both companies reduce prices, the increase in the consumption of the soft drinks will offset the lowering of prices and profits will increase, but to a lesser extent, and also to a lesser extent than if they had cooperated. Also, when we look at nature, game theory can even be used to analyse why species may coexist rather than the dog-eat-dog type that the natural world is often depicted as. For example, there are species of birds that enter crocodiles' mouths to eat parasites, which you can see in that picture. This symbiosis allows crocodiles to achieve good oral hygiene and allows the birds to get a meal. So it's a win-win situation, really. But obviously, any crocodile could easily eat the bird, i.e. defect. though through evolution, the crocodiles and birds have learned the benefits of cooperation, so i.e. the equilibrium point. But of course, these animals do not rationalize their behavior with game theory, but it can still be modeled using its principles. So I hope these various examples have shown you how widely game theory can be applied, as at its core, it is about strategy, which is obviously useful in real-world scenarios outside of an economics textbook. I hope I gave you an interesting introduction to game theory, and with Vinay as well, and we'll pass on to Warwick Data Science Society for the rest of the event.
Okay, so I'm Tim, as mentioned, and I'm the president of Warwick Data Science Society. So let's start by giving a big thank you to everyone watching this talk. It is amazing to see how many people are interested in that intersection between game theory and data science. And also a thank you to